Salt, once worth more than gold. If I asked you to name the most valuable substance in human history, you'd probably say gold. Maybe even oil, or something locked in a vault with armed guards, perhaps. You probably wouldn't say the little thing sitting on your table right now, though. This is Fun Facts with Josh, and today we're talking about the mineral that was once mattered more than gold and quietly shaped civilizations itself. Chapter 1. The only mineral you cannot live without. Gold is shiny, silver is useful, oil is powerful, but salt's mandatory. Your body can't function without it. Sodium ions are what allows your nervous system to fire. They regulate muscle movement, they control fluid balance in your whole body. Without salt, your heart doesn't beat correctly, your brain doesn't signal properly, and eventually you don't survive. Early humans learned this the hard way. Long before chemistry explained sodium and chloride, people noticed something simple. Animals traveled long distances to lick certain rocks or drink from specific water sources. Those places mattered, and humans followed. This wasn't about taste, it was about staying alive. And once humans began settling down, farming, raising animals, building villages, salt became even more important. Because food didn't last, meat spoiled, fish rotted, harvests failed. Unless you had salt, salt could dry meat, it could preserve fish, it could stretch food supplies throughout the winter. In a world without refrigeration, salt didn't just flavor food, it created time. Time to survive to the next season, time to grow populations, time to build something permanent. That's when salt stopped being a curiosity and started becoming a power. Chapter 2. Salt, Settlement, and the First Trade Networks. Once people realized salt could preserve food, they immediately ran into a problem. Salt was not evenly distributed. Some regions had salt flats. Some had access to coastal regions. Others had nothing. If you lived near salt, you could preserve food, store supplies, and survive longer. If you didn't, you traded for it. And just like that, salt created some of the earliest trade routes in human history. Long before coins, long before banks, long before writing in some cases even. People carried salt across the deserts, through the mountain passes, and along rivers because it was lighter than food and more valuable than most goods. Entire cities grew where salt could be harvested. Villages formed near salt springs. Towns rose around evaporation ponds. Empires expanded to control the salt resources that they controlled. And here's the key transitioning point. Once salt became necessary for survival, anyone who controlled salt could control the people. This is where salt stops being a food story and becomes a political one. Hence, why salt becomes more valuable than gold. Gold looks impressive, but you can't eat it, you can't preserve your food with it, and you definitely can't keep an army alive on it. But salt did. An army without salt couldn't preserve meats, it couldn't maintain health, and it couldn't march for very long. Which is why across multiple civilizations from China to Africa, all the way to Europe, salt was treated as a strategic resource, and nowhere is this clearer than in Rome. Roman soldiers were issued salt rations. Salt was transported along dedicated roads. Salt supplies were guarded even. In fact, the word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, a payment related to salt. Now, before everyone on the internet corrects me all at the same time, remember this. Roman soldiers were not literally paid in piles of salt, but salt was a state-controlled commodity, and compensation was often tied to access to it. That alone tells you how valuable it was. At the same time, China developed state salt monopolies. African kingdoms controlled trans-Saharan salt trade routes. Entire economics rose and fell based on who could move the white crystal from one place to the other. Different cultures, same conclusion. If you controlled salt, you controlled stability. And once governments realized that people needed salt, not just wanted it, needed it, the next step was inevitable. They taxed it, they regulated it, and they weaponized it. And that's where salt stops being a background resource and starts triggering riots and revolutions and collapses the trust between people and power. Chapter 3. When Salt Became Power. By the time the civilization understood salt's value, it was already too late to pretend that it was just food. Salt was survival, salt was preservation, and salt was stability. And essentially, nothing ever stays neutral for long, because once people needed something, whoever controlled it gains leverage. This realization didn't happen all at once. It emerged slowly as governments noticed patterns. Regions with reliable salt supplies were healthier, their armies lasted longer, and their populations grew faster. Regions without salt were vulnerable. They depended on trade, and trade meant exposure. So rulers did what rulers have always done. They moved in and conquered the resources. Salt as a strategic resource was the key. Across the ancient world, salt production became guarded, not protected for safety, but protected for power. In China, salt production was placed under the state control early on. That logic was very simple. Everyone needs salt, consumption is predictable, demand never disappears. Which makes salt the perfect taxable good. Unlike luxury items, people could opt out of those. You could avoid silk, you could avoid living without jewelry, you could not live without salt. That made salt taxes incredibly reliable and incredibly dangerous. Because when a government taxes something essential, every increase is felt immediately. And remember, Rome, roads, control. In Rome, salt moved along dedicated trade routes. The Via Salaria, or the salt roads, connected inland settlements to coastal salt supplies. This wasn't coincidence either. Rome understood logistics. An army that couldn't eat couldn't conquer. Salt preserved meat, salt kept soldiers healthy, and salt allowed Rome to project power far from home. Control the salt routes and you control the legions. But Rome didn't invent this idea, they just perfected it. Salt as a currency became money. Salt didn't just preserve foods, it preserved order. And in many regions, salt functioned as a proto-currency, not because people wanted it to, but because everybody agreed of its true value. You could trade salt for grain, labor, or protection, not because salt was shiny, but because it solved real problems. And this is why salt could rival gold in the value. Gold stored wealth, salt would merely create it. Chapter 4. Taxes, monopolies, and the breaking point. Once states realized that salt could fund governments, they pushed harder and even harder. Salt monopolies spread. Governments claimed executive rights to produce, distribute, and price salt. Private production was banned. Smuggling became a crime, and prices climbed. For rulers, salt taxes were efficient. For the public, they were suffocating. Because salt wasn't optional. You couldn't boycott it. You couldn't wait for a sale. You just had to pay. This is where salt stops being an economic story and becomes a social one. In France, salt was taxed through the gabelle, one of the most hated taxes in the country. Salt prices varied wildly by region. Some people paid almost nothing, other people paid several times more. Smuggling became common and punishments were severe. As resentment grew, the gabelle didn't cause the French Revolution by itself, but it became a symbol. A daily reminder that the states controlled even the most basic necessities. Every meal reinforced anger, salt, and civil disobedience. Centuries later, salt still had a symbolic power. When people wanted to protest unfair rule, they didn't always target places, they targeted salt. The most famous example? India. Under the British colonial rules, salt production was tightly controlled and taxed. Even though salt could be harvested locally, Indians were forced to buy British salt instead. So when the resistance came, it wasn't loud at first. It was quiet, a walk, a deliberate act of making salt illegally. Because sometimes the most powerful protest is breaking a rule when everyone knows it's just wrong. Salt became more than a mineral. It became a statement. Despite revolts, governments kept taxing salt because the math was just too good. Salt consumption didn't drop in recessions. It doesn't care about trends, and it doesn't disappear during war. It's just steady, predictable, and reliable, which makes it irresistible to states that need money to function. But every increase carried risk, because salt wasn't just part of the economy, it was part of daily life. And when daily life becomes unaffordable, people notice. Eventually something changed. Not governments, not taxes, technology. Because the moment humans figured out how to preserve food without relying on salt, that's when everything changed. Salt's grip on civilization would begin to loosen, and at that point, the shift would change everything. Chapter 5: The moment salt stopped controlling the world. For thousands of years, salt held civilizations together because of its single brutal problem: food doesn't last. Meat would spoil, fish would rot, and harvest would fail. Salt was the only reliable way to slow time. But eventually, humans did what they always do. They innovated a workaround. The decline of salt's dominance didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages. First came better storage methods. Then came canning. Then ice harvesting and cold cellars. And finally, refrigeration. Once food could be preserved mechanically, salt stopped being a gatekeeper of survival. Meat no longer needed to be packed in crystals. Fish didn't have to be tried into submission, and entire populations could eat food without depending on nearby salt supplies. This single shift did more to reduce salt's power than any revolution ever could have. Because once salt stopped being an essential preservation, it stopped being a choke point. And choke points are where power lives. Here's the interesting part. Salt didn't vanish when it lost power. It became invisible. We still need salt biologically. Our bodies still rely on sodium to function, but now it's just everywhere. It's cheap, it's abundant, and absolutely taken for granted. What once caused war is now torn in an open paper packet and forgotten on the table. And that's the difference between scarcity value and infrastructure value. Salt didn't stop being important, it stopped being scarce. As industrial food production expanded, salt found a new role. Not as a survival tool, but as a flavor enhancer and a preservative of convenience. Governments no longer needed salt monopolies to fund themselves. Taxes would shift elsewhere, and control would also shift elsewhere. Salt was demoted from strategic resource to background utility. It's still essential, it's just no longer powerful. Chapter 6: Salt teaches us about value. Salt's story isn't really about salt, it's about value. Gold was always rare. Oil became valuable when machines needed it. Salt was valuable because humans hadn't solved a problem yet. Once the problem was solved, the value changed. Not because salt changed, but because we did. That happens over and over again in history. Resources matter until the technology removes their leverage. Control exists until dependency disappears. Salt didn't fall from grace, it was just replaced. Modern societies still rely on things that have choke points: energy, data, supply chains, water. And just like salt, their power exists only as long as alternatives don't. Salt reminds us of something uncomfortable. What feels permanent almost never is. So the next time you reach for salt, remember what it used to mean. Not flavor, but survival. Empires were built on it, revolutions were sparked by it, and governments rose and fell trying to control it. All from a mineral so common today, we barely notice it even exists. Thank you for watching Fun Facts with Josh. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one, and I'll catch you next time.